You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
My name is Peter Boettke. I am the director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at George Mason University's Mercatus Center. And I'm here talking today with Professor Alain Marciano of the University of Montpellier, where Alain is also the scientific director of the Montpellier Research Institute in Economics. Alain is currently finishing up on a biography, intellectual biography on James Buchanan, and has done a lot of work here in the archives. Welcome, Alain.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah. So I wanted to start by just asking you a little bit about the Buchanan project and sort of two different levels. One of them is just to give the listeners a sort of a sense of the state, because this is the state of the materials, because a lot of people don't know about the state of the materials. You've been involved in working with these materials for over a decade, really, I think, or close to a decade, right?
More
and
than a decade.
So you had the old archives in the Buchanan house, which you worked with, and now you have the library that has done a job. And maybe you could just explain a little bit about the difference between the two regimes and whatnot.
Yes, actually I've been working on the archives since 2007. So it's more than a decade. So
Yeah.
it was, at that time the papers were located in Buchanan House, as you know. So, and they were located in different places, including the elevator shaft and the basement, which was a bit, which explains that some of the papers now are a bit beaten at the edges. So it was a bit of a mess, if you allow me, and it was difficult to find out what was written in which order, so there were a lot of holes. So myself, I think it's, I have to say that I've been a victim of that, in the sense that doing the archives, I probably missed some of the papers that were, because they were not, have not been processed.
Right.
So they were mixed up. And so you were working, let's say, on a paper on 1962. Probably you missed something because it was in a folder located in the basement or elsewhere. Who knows? I don't know who had been in the archives at that time, but not so many people probably. And yes, you had the kindness to involve me in the project with Solomon Stein at some point, and I saw all the people process that, and now I am looking at the archives that are almost completely processed. I say almost because I think that there is not problems, but some improvements possible in the directories and the list of papers, but of material. But now the difference is huge. I mean, working on the archives, even when I started to work with Solomon, I don't remember exactly when it was, probably 3 or 4 years ago. Even 3 or 4 years ago, it was not like it is now.
Yeah.
So now it's huge. The difference is tremendous, and it's really comfortable. Besides the fact that the people at the library are very nice, that it's very comfortable to work on the archives because it's ordered. You can find, so there are the directory sheets, so you can find the papers. They are in folders. So now I think that it's easier, it's more comfortable. It's impossible to miss papers. It's impossible to miss letters. So, and I think that someone who, it's very different to work on Buchanan now than it, I mean,
Yeah.
In terms of archives, it's very different to work on Buchanan now than it has been in, as I said, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So
I'm hoping that our students and others will take advantage of this opportunity, because and I'll come back to this in a second. I do think that, so I moved to George Mason in 1998, and I taught inside the Buchanan house because I took over Jim's course in constitutional political economy. And I also worked in some of those, archives. I had over the years graduate students that worked in the processing of the photos. Remember how that little computer out in the front, they had all the photos digitized that were there and whatnot. But it was more of a working office and memorabilia rather than an idea of a working archive. I had myself worked in the archives for Hayek and some other things out at Hoover, and knew about the idea about, and the London School of Economics, and understood about the idea of finding aids and things like that. And so in the old days when you were working in it, Sonia Amade worked, I think, a little bit in it. Steve Medema visited a little bit. Ross Emmett, David Levy, Sandra Pert, myself. You kind of discovered what it is that was already known, because the finding aid was Joanne, and you would go and say, hey, where's that? And she would say this, or going back further, it'd be Betty. And one of the things that was really amazing to me was the fact that Betty's papers were never processed until the library got involved at all. So her office was, and she was the source of everything really for all the information in Charlottesville, in Blacksburg, and in Fairfax. And so it really is an opening up. And the reason why I think this is so phenomenally rich archives, and what we can thank the librarians here at George Mason now for doing and making this project really, the way it is that Buchanan, and I'd like your reaction to this. I'm pretty sure you'll agree with me. Buchanan never allowed himself, he was always an outsider, but he had an insider's claim. And so he never thought of himself as like an outsider of the economics profession. So he wanted to engage the economics profession at a very basic level of theoretical conceptualizations of the field of public finance, but also in price theory and in things like cost and choice, and also in like fundamental methodology of economics, pushing for an exchange view of economics, or even for that matter, fields like law and economics as well, besides public choice and political economy. And so to me, I think that there's a record inside of that archive of a counterfactual of what 20th century economics could have looked like, right? And that is really quite fascinating for potential scholars, I think, because it's not like he was working in isolation from the mainstream, but he's working in distinction from the mainstream, but with a constant push at the mainstream for them to pay attention. So as you've talked about at other times, like his attempt to engage Samuelson wasn't like a fanboy to Samuelson. At the same time, it wasn't like, oh, you're not, whatever you're doing is worthless kind of thing. It was a way to kind of negotiate the conversation with him. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on, the kind of Buchanan substance of what's in the archives.
Yes, just one word to react and follow up on what you just said, not only on about Samuelson, but about all the others. I mean, when you look at the archives, when you read the correspondence, you find a lot of letters Buchanan writing to, especially in the 60s, more in the 60s than in the 50s, maybe because he felt more involved in the profession, more an insider. I will come back on that. But even in the 50s, so every time he disagreed or he was puzzled by something who had been written by someone else, he wrote a comment. So it was one of his things to write comments. So and another point is that Earl Hamilton, who was the editor of the JPE in the 50s, knew Buchanan from Chicago, and he sent him a lot of books to review. So Buchanan wrote a lot of book reviews. So this is part of his way of doing economics, reacting to what others were doing. So he wrote a lot of book reviews. He wrote a lot of letters to other scholars, not only Samuelson. So Samuelson is the most remarkable because now Samuelson, so he was already at that time a golden boy, the golden boy, right. But it now is even more famous than in '54. But before that, he wrote to Rolfe, about incidence taxation theory of incidence in taxation. So he disagreed with Rolfe, but he wrote to him to engage in the discussion. He wrote to Musgrave also at the same period, 55, 56, before going to Italy. He wrote to Musgrave, and he disagreed with Musgrave. So, and the fact that he disagreed with Musgrave on certain points didn't prevent him to write Musgrave, write Samuelson, write Rolfe. And you see that all the time during the 50s and the 60s. I focus mainly in this period, and also in the 70s. But after the 70s, it's a bit different because he had a network. He knew a lot of people, much more people than the 50s. But part of his way of doing economics was to exchange with others. And as you rightly said, I'm not sure he ever felt, at least in the 50s and the 60s, he didn't see himself as an outsider. He was an economist. He was an economist, and he was no less an economist than Samuelson or Musgrave, even if their approaches were different. And I'm not sure he felt that they were different, but even if, or Arrow, for instance, he was an economist like them, so he didn't see him as an outsider. So he wanted to be part of the economic debate in terms of science, in terms of policy implications, in terms of policy recommendations. So he was involved in that. What is significant also in that regard is the summer he spent at the Rand Corporation. So when he arrived at the Rand Corporation, he was not so sure that it could be helpful to these people. And when he was visiting consultant at the summer during the summer of 1954, and there were a lot of people. There were Samuelson there, Arrow, Lindblom, Alchan, and well, the list is long like that. So he spent the summer discussing with these people, writing to them, and discussing, writing reports, memos. So it was part of his way of doing economics. So, and I think that this is something that you really grasp when you look at the archives. I don't know, there are 70 boxes of letters. So, I don't know if it completely answer your question, but I think that the archives really give you this impression that there is a lot of material because Buchanan was trying to involve himself in the functioning of the profession.
I mean, there's 192 at moment. There's 192 linear feet of archives. It's a huge archive, and it's an amazing testimony, I think, to actually not only Buchanan, but also to Betty Tillman in making sure that she maintained all of that correspondence over the years and whatnot. So it is a pretty phenomenal project, actually. There's so much to learn in that. I wanted to sort of push you a little bit on to discuss. You have a recent paper that came out on Buchanan public finance of the Tennessee years. And I want to begin with the beginning. So Buchanan gets his PhD, moves to Tennessee as his first job, and he's working in public finance. And so that's kind of his beginning of his career. And he starts writing the papers that become his seminal papers that create his career, beginning in 49, as my colleague Dick Wagner has emphasized, but also then again in 54. But besides that, he's doing a lot of very just basic applied economics, and you've unearthed a lot of that and those debates. So maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
Yes, because I was interested. So I did, as all the people who read Buchanan do. I start with, as you said, a seminal paper, 1949, A Pure Theory of Government Finance. And so I read this paper. I was lucky to find the original version of the papers, which is much longer. Actually, so it's not so different. It's much longer. One of the referees was Milton Friedman. So, and it's interesting because when you look at the original, the first preliminary version, there are equations in it. So we have the impression when we read the published version, there are no equations. So, and a lot of, let's say, philosophical references. Give the impression that Buchanan was interested in doing something very different from what the other economists were doing. But actually, his first move had been to do something very, I'm not going to say neoclassical, but something very standard with equation ratios of marginal utilities. And so Friedman told him to remove that because it was wrong. So, so I think that it's interesting. So he removed that, and the paper remains as it is. But I realized after that that it was not Buchanan's first paper. So he had a previous paper published earlier in 1949 on the marginal pricing, marginal price applied to railroad tariffs. So because it was a very important problem for the southern economy, or the economy of the South. But what I was interested in is what he wrote before. So not only his dissertation, but some of the papers he wrote when he was a student. And I found, so one of the papers about the Tennessee years you mentioned, is a paper about one of his essays that he wrote before he went to Chicago, so before the war. And it was about, so it's really simple, but at the same time there is a very interesting, there are two interesting ideas in it. One is that, and Buchanan will stick to this idea a very long time, that the users of public goods have to pay the prices for the goods they use. And in that case, it's applied to roads and the price of roads. So the user of roads have to pay the price for the road services. And also, there is also a point which is interesting, is that the reference to ethics in terms of repartition, because the idea is how to distribute the benefit of the taxes. So the taxes are perceived by the state, but they have to be redistributed to the counties, because the roads are managed by the counties. So how do you split the benefit of the taxes? And Buchanan thought that the benefit of the taxes should be split on ethical terms. So it means that for me it was important because it was 1940, and this is something that never changed in his career. The reference to ethics, the role of ethics in the distribution, in some sense, in distribution of income among different agents.
Yeah, and so that's a different origin story than either Marianne Johnson or even Dick Wagner tells in his book, because you have a lot of these themes prior to him supposedly reading Wicksell in the Harper Library at the end, or having. But how about the Knight story about how he comes into Chicago as a kind of a socialist, and then he has Knight, and then Knight sort of enlightens him or whatever. Explain what you found in the archives about that.
Just a remark about the Wicksell. Actually, yes, Marianne Johnson and Dick Wagner, I think, already emphasized the fact that there is no epiphany, the so-called epiphany that he talked about in the Nobel reception lecture. I don't know why he mentioned that, or he forged that story, but there is no epiphany. But they had emphasized that he read Wicksell for his dissertation, but the main part of his dissertation is based on something in which he was interested before having read Wicksell. Right. And it's, for me, it's the same thing with Knight. So Buchanan, the story you mentioned, he arrived at Chicago in January 46, and then he attends Knight's classes and becomes a Knightian. So the part which is true is that he was probably, quote unquote, a socialist before coming to Chicago. At least he was relatively in favor of the strong intervention of the state. So, but arriving at Chicago, he has lectures with, and I think that the first professor he had who influenced him was not Knight but Simons. Mm-hmm. I think it can be assumed relatively firmly. It was Simons who taught him during the spring semester, from January to March or April. I don't know if it's a spring semester, but the first 3 months of 1946, it was Simons who taught him public finance. And I think that this course has a tremendous importance for Buchanan. It was this course that changed his views on the free market and the free enterprise, and the idea that you have to have that there were two dimensions that Simons emphasized: the free market in economy and decentralized political system. These are the two dimensions that Buchanan emphasized also in his graduate student essays and in his dissertation. You have to have at the same time the economy, which is that has to function on a free market, and the state that has to be decentralized. And this, I think that when he arrived at Chicago, he was the relatively in favor of a centralized economy. So this is what changed. And then after that, he had Knight. Probably after Simons died, he had Knight during the summer of 1946.
Yeah.
And then I'm not sure that Knight really influenced him at that time. But I cannot really prove that. But I'm not sure. The Knight's influence came later.
Yeah.
But it's maybe it's too revisionist.
Yeah. I'm gonna bring up Knight and come back to Knight in a second, but I wanted to first see if you could just maybe say a few words about what I think is a very brilliant paper that you've written and has been justly awarded a Best Paper Award, which is on your paper that's in the History of Political Economy on basically the education of a constitutional political economist. And I would like you to, if you can, just say a few words about that paper and the lessons that you learned as a scholar yourself in seeing Buchanan's learning in the development of his research program.
That it was a paper that took us, because it's co-authored with a friend, Jean-Baptiste Fleury. It was a paper that took us a long time to write because it was a bit tricky for various reasons. One of the reasons was that it involved what Buchanan had written in 1959 during the so-called massive resistance in Virginia, and therefore it involved a lot of issues with segregation and desegregation. What I've learned is that maybe three things. I try not to forget the three things that I want to emphasize. First is Buchanan as a positive economist. So I think that this is something that is probably too frequently misunderstood. When Buchanan said, it's the 1959 paper on positive and normative economy. So Buchanan said, I am a positive economist, but I make a normative statement. And I think that this normative statement does not prevent him to be a positive economist. So he makes a normative statement by saying that, by giving this definition of being positive. But he remains a positive economist in the sense that he doesn't try to impose his own views, or at least he thinks that he is not trying to impose his own views on what should be done. In that case, it's in education and segregation. So I think it's important because it gives the idea that Buchanan didn't want to impose anything on the others. What he wanted to do was to define a frame, or could say a constitutional frame, but it didn't use the word. It tried to define a frame that allowed many people to live their lives. Didn't want to be coercive. So this is the first point. The second point is about it's more about the methodology and the methodology of history of economics, in the sense that when we wrote the paper, we tried to stick to what was written, trying not to fill the gaps when there were gaps, and trying not to over-interpret what could be interpreted.
Yeah.
So it's very tricky because the issue is very sensitive, and we tend to judge it with our views. I mean, the views of our times. So saying that imposing our frame, the frame of the beginning of the 21st century to what was happening 60 years ago, is probably a mistake. So I think that we had to, and this is one of the reasons for which I think it's interesting to look in the archives, because it tends to oblige us not to be too rationalist, not to reconstruct too much what was happening. We have the archives, so we have to stick to what we
Disciplined.
have. Yes, it disciplines ourselves. And this is also related to the third point, the fact that the archives may be tricky also because we might be tempted to over-interpret what we have. So the archives, the letters are interesting because they lead us to stick to the reality in some sense. But at the same time, we must not over-interpret what are in the letters. For instance, if we find a letter saying something, we have to think that maybe the letter was written strategically.
Yeah.
Maybe it was written for a certain purpose. We don't know what the purpose was. So it's interesting to have this letter because it gives us some information. But on the other hand, the information that we get from this letter might be problematic. Mm-hmm. So we have to be very careful. So this is something that, so the lessons I received, I got from writing this paper were about Buchanan, his attitude towards the public debate and the kind of intolerance. I know that some people are not going to like that, but I think that that's one of the letters about him, the lessons about him, is tolerance, and it's related to his constitutional approach. Right. And another lesson, or the two other lessons, are methodological, about what we have to do as historians of economic thought.
Well, I think that the paper is a brilliant exposition of that. In reading the universal case, I mean, so there's a couple things that I just want to sort of maybe we can talk a little bit about. One of them is that the paper itself that was written in 1959 is authored by Nutter and Buchanan, which is different from Buchanan and Nutter. And so I was wondering whether or not in the archives you had come across other examples where Buchanan was the second author, not alphabetical. So that, and what that might mean. The other thing is that in that piece, which I think has been very, I might be guilty of reading too much in because, again, Buchanan was my teacher, and I read in a lot of his values from 1984 when I first encountered him as a person, back into, things that might have been going on. But when I read that paper, one of the things that sticks out for me in the beginning is the unequivocal statement in the beginning that we're one another's equal, right? And that we have to treat one another as one another's equals. That education is the great leveler, right? He was a defender of public education in the sense that it's the great educator. That's why it's called universal education. And that he's going to have standards established for education. So the vouchers aren't going to go to any school. It has to be a school that meets the standards of education, because education is the vehicle for the great levelers, for the least advantaged in society, which who he's trying to reach out to. And he believes in redistribution. The way he's going to finance the educational system is that he's going to have redistributive taxation in order to do that, so that the wealthy, and the last thing he wants the school system to do is reinforce the elite of society. So the interpretation of this essay is often very confusing to me, because all of those positions are in fact the positions that Buchanan spends a large part of his life arguing for. In fact, to the great disapproval of a lot of libertarian people that didn't, thought he was not, and he took great joy in arguing with libertarians about these positions, I will tell you. It's a kind of a fascinating thing how he has this, and so the way I see that is what you just articulated is that on one hand you make a distinction between the production of a public good and then the delivery of the public good, and so he would argue that education is a public good in many ways, but that's why the voucher system is involved there. But you don't need necessarily the state to be the producer, because you could have the schools be produced by private entities, but the state is financing the production of the public good of this, and so you have a financing is different from the production is different from the distribution of the good, and this is an important part in a lot of his other discussions about public goods as well, I would say, and just to bring this back to the 49 paper, I always thought one of the key things in the 49 paper was that we cannot do public finance unless we also postulate a theory of the state. And in postulating the theory of the state, you have to postulate the scale and scope of what the state is involved in doing. And so being able to understand the scale and scope is also going to be a function of being able to understand this issue having to do with the production and distribution of the public good, because that changes the nature of the kind. So maybe you can just say a few words about that, because I think I'd like us to move on to the democracy and Knight and those kind of questions. But I just wanted to hit this point because I think it's such a critical point within the actual economics of the economics of universal education, in addition to the constitutional point about who's responsible for producing what, when, and where, which is the federalist position, which is a different point. Yeah.
It's a different point. And all the points you mentioned are totally exact, of course, and equally important. One of the important points is the point about the equality of treatment. Buchanan has defended very early in his career the idea of an equal treatment of equals. And actually, it's not an idea that it's not his idea. It's an idea that you find in a lot of writings in the 19th century. The names evades me right now, but I think that even Pigou mentioned the need to have an equal treatment of equals. So it's not so original. Buchanan, at that time when he wrote his dissertation, he knew that it was not original, but he knew that it was also a criterion that was not so frequently used. So he reintroduced this idea of an equal treatment of equals, and it has been the basis of his, I would say, philosophy for a long time. And this is what justifies his focus on redistribution. Yeah. So you rightly mentioned the importance of redistribution for Buchanan. He has always been, for me, one of his major claims has been to promote redistribution. He was in favor of redistribution. He has always been in favor of redistribution from the beginning of his career. And not only in favor of redistribution, but the idea that there should be a redistribution from the rich to the poor, from the rich states to the poor states, from the rich people to the poor people. So I don't know how you can twist that or you can misinterpret that, but I think that it's for me it's a very noble statement, because and even put that in before efficiency. So in 1952 we had an exchange with Scott about the question of efficiency of grants, and Scott disagreed with grants because they were against efficiency, because grants prevented the move of resources to the places where would bring the most important value. And Buchanan reacted by saying part of his argument was that efficiency was not granted and ethics what you say about ethics, the ethics of allowing people who live in poor area to benefit from the same level as people living in a rich area. So I think that he felt concerned by that because he lived in a poor area, of course. But it's more than that. When you read his articles, he mentions the South only once. So most of the time he used the term poor states. He doesn't refer to the redistribution from the north to the south. It's a redistribution from the rich to the poor states. So it's very important in terms. In 1959, it was about education. Before
right.
it had been roads,
yeah.
roads and highways.
Yeah.
It was exactly the same thing.
Right.
So it's really a central point in his analysis.
No, I think that's right. I mean, it's a public finance point is what he's making, but a public finance from a certain perspective. One of the things that I think I've become acutely aware of, because it's hard sometimes when you are a student of somebody, you adopt a lot of the tacit ideas of them, and you just sort of, that's like what you do, because part of it is just learning under them, and other part is also the homo studenomicus aspect, which is I want to pass the right essays that he's going to give me good grades on, so I need to write kind of what he thinks, and so you just tacitly adapt these things. But what I've learned recently is that Buchanan does put a lot of burden on his reader, because he's a Vixelian in both the benefit principle and in the unanimity. He is a Knightian in terms of the basic economics, as well as sort of his economics is economics. It's sort of Knight and Simon's kind of economics, but at the same time, he's also Knight puzzling with the problems of social costs, the problems of collective action, basically intelligence and democratic action, and this fundamental commitment to democracy, which is throughout Knight's position as well. And if you don't understand if you miss any one of those constituent parts of what makes up Buchanan, you end up by missing the picture of what he's up to, because you miss out like why it is that he wants to see politics as exchange, or why is it he wants to have certain threshold rules that protect from exploitation in the political process. So you can have political externalities as well as you can have market externalities. Mm-hmm. And so you got to worry about the political externalities, which is what he's obsessed with in terms of the calculus of consent in many ways. So anyway, it's the work that you're doing on that, and the education of a constitutionalist, and bringing up these kind of positions, especially with these technical public economics, I just think is very, very valuable. So I want to congratulate you on that work. I did want to sort of raise this issue. We've talked a little bit about it, but I want to ask you a question next, and just about Buchanan. This is a little later. Buchanan and Knight, and in particular Knight on this democracy and liberalism aspect, and from that then how you see the relationship between Hayek and Buchanan, if there is one. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, Buchanan, as I said earlier, I think that Buchanan became Knightian relatively slowly. Knight's ideas permeated, and progressively Buchanan discovered that they were important. He knew that they were important, but maybe he was concerned by other questions before becoming really a Knightian, before realizing how focusing on democracy was so important even for economists. He realized that, I think, for me, he realized that the importance of political institutions for economists very early, as you said, 1949. You cannot do public finance if you do not have a theory of the state. But he really wrote about that a bit later, and realized the importance of democracy for economists later. But at the same time, I mean, in the mid-50s, when Arrow wrote his book, when Dahl and Lindblom wrote their book, so it was the beginning of public choice. Before public choice, before Downs, before Turlock, it was earlier than that. Yes, I was going to mention something about. Anyway, so sorry.
No, so I mean, when you go into the archives, you haven't gotten to this part of the story yet, because you're talking about the technical economics and then its interface with political science, right? In some sense, including political theory. But by the time he recamps to Virginia, and you had the wonderful opportunity of visiting University of Virginia this week, and they found the Thomas Jefferson Center, and the archives reveal that they have he and Nutter have a kind of a strong commitment to see a reclaiming of classical economics in some sense, as against the technocracy of the utilitarians, the engineers, kind of idea of economics. And so that's part of this education of the political economists as well. And I was wondering if you could, because that's what the relationship I meant about Hayek. And so Hayek writes the Constitution of Liberty in 1960, but he's presenting all those papers from the Road to Serfdom to that time. That's part of the milieu that Buchanan is running in. So there must be something about that that's there for him as well. But have you found any strong evidence on that?
No strong evidence, but once again, a conviction.
Yeah.
I mean, a conviction that, as I said just before, there is something that is happening, yes, before the Thomas Jefferson Center, around the mid-50s. Arrow has written this book in the early 50s, 51, but Buchanan has the opportunity to review the book only in 53. So I haven't found anything about the why 53, but probably Hamilton sent him the book to review in 53. So Buchanan wrote the review at the beginning of 54. At that time, he had also read Dahl and Lindblom. And you see, so I see a difference. It's not very difficult to perceive, because you just have to read the references in the published work. And the published works show a difference in the references when you look at the paper. For instance, the two papers he wrote in 1954. The first is a review of Arrow's book, and the second is the comparison between voting and the market. In the book review of Arrow's, he refers to Michael Polanyi's book.
Mm-hmm.
That's all, more or less. The rest of the references are more classical. There is the Alain Lindblom, and when you look at the second paper, there are references to Mises, references to Hayek. So the perspective is totally different.
Yeah.
And I think that this is the year that changes everything. 1954. Buchanan's perspective changes at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that in 57 with Nutter, they had a view that was a bit different. They insist when they create the Thomas Jefferson Center on the need to go back to classical political economy. The change in Buchanan was already at work before, not far before, but a few years before he went to Italy. I don't know yet if things had happened in Italy that have pushed him further in this direction. But I think that the real changes occurred before that. And my intuition is that Dahl and Lindblom's book played an important role in this process, because their book is it's a thick book with a lot of references, in particular references to Hayek, to Mises, to Polanyi, to these kind of authors that Buchanan started to read at about the same period, or to read more, at least to refer to. Yeah. So the change to classical liberalism. And it makes sense to assume that it was then that he really became enlightened, because maybe it was at that time that he remembered the Knight's teachings.
Right.
When you look at the Buchanan's notes, lecture notes of Knight's course, in June 1946, you realize that everything is there. But we realized that now,
Right. Yeah.
after having read what Buchanan has written. So maybe that Buchanan in 1946 didn't realize the importance.
He was just taking notes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so he was concerned by public finance in the South,
Right.
how to redistribute income to poor states.
Right.
So he was not really concerned by big issues about democracy. And this came progressively. It took a few years, but in 1957, maybe that discussing with Nutter helped him to switch to a different perspective. But I think that 55, 56, there was a change that occurred in Buchanan's mind.
I was just thinking as you were talking that one of the things that's very interesting about Buchanan but makes him somewhat foreboding to a lot of people is that, he did try to think about these big questions, but he always thought about them guided by a certain version of economic modeling, right? So like he would be very comfortable using a basic economic reasoning to then try to tackle a very hairy political philosophical question. Even think about like models that I don't know how much you'll talk about them later on in your book, or maybe that will be after, but like the Samaritan's Dilemma, paper and things like that. It's like the brilliance of it. It's captured in an older essay, a very late essay by him on the simple analytics of natural liberty, where he like just plays with various different economic models of what it would mean in the Adam Smith's deer and beaver model if you had these little shifts of that or the other thing. And that's how his mind worked. And so unless you kind of get into that game with him, you're not really understanding what's going on. And I think it makes it difficult for people that are outside of economics, or at least outside of a kind of a rational choice analytics to sort of see what's going on.
Yeah, but I think that it's difficult for a lot of people, even in economics.
Yeah.
Because his way of thinking was, as you said, it was using maybe very basic economic thinking, but strong concepts. And it was interesting in the ideas, in the concepts, much more than in the axiomatics or the analytics of economics. So some people who think that it was too simple.
Yeah.
It was confusing because it didn't use the correct concepts.
Right.
So Buchanan, for instance, wrote. You mentioned the Samaritan's Dilemma. So the analytics of the Samaritan's Dilemma are very simple, but the strength of the paper is elsewhere.
Right.
When you look at the externality, the paper on externality is the same thing. A lot of graphs and because he used a lot of graphs and curves.
Right.
But I think that the core of the paper is not in the ratios.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting because I think that Buchanan, in like Cost and Choice, the subtitle is like basically inquiry into elements of economic theory or something. And he stressed this idea constantly about sort of the basics and getting the basics right, because he thought his colleagues had forgotten the basics. And so even when he makes a kind of normative claim about the role of economics in education, like what is the justification for publicly funding of economic education and research, his argument is it's our pedagogical role in communicating the elementary principles of our discipline. And he says his colleagues get derailed because they get bored with the elementary principles, and the properly trained economist, will never get bored. And so it's always this persistent and consistent application of the economic way of thinking to these various walks of life, but then also a recognition of the limits of that, and then, so it's a fascinating exercise that you're working with. Yeah.
Yes. It's I think it's fascinating because it's really maybe I'm biased, but it's really what economics should be.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting when you compare, for instance, what Samuelson wrote in 54 and what Buchanan wrote on public goods at about the same periods. Of course, Samuelson was already someone with a great reputation, already very skilled in mathematics and this kind of stuff, but you realize that they were not aiming at the same target, the same goal. In some sense, Samuelson was trying to write the most, well, his words, most abstract paper. So the 1954 paper, a paper that played such a role in the development of public economics in the 20th century, is what, 3-page long, 4-page long, and so there is one equation. So it takes more equation to explain the paper to students in course than they are in the. So you have to reconstruct the paper to understand what Samuelson meant. And when you read Buchanan, it's totally different. It's mostly its words. So in 1956, he wrote a paper on roads, and there are very few equations. And so for me, it's really the problem of social cost. Actually, Cose's problem of social cost was more or less in Buchanan 1956. Again, I am biased because I'm writing on Buchanan, and I think that everything is in Buchanan because of that. But Buchanan, so this article was only words, mostly words. There are a few equations, but there are words. And so you see two different ways of doing economics. And this is what you said. He was trying to use basic economic reasoning. This doesn't mean that it's simple. Easy to read. It's not simple at all. But he was trying to reason with concepts, not with technical tools.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree with you on that. You brought up Coase. The relationship, I don't, it would take us too long to delve deeply into this because they were colleagues and they interacted, and the difference between the problem of social costs and the discussions in cost and choice and these kind of things. But I do think it's fascinating in the sense that to Buchanan and to Coase, economics naturally bled into law and economics because if you don't do welfare economics like the way with a stable social welfare function, and you're not going to be the sort of utilitarian engineer, right? You're going to actually do politics as exchange, and you're going to look at the institutions within which those exchange takes place. And so you're going to limit yourself to the structural rules of the game. One of the structural rules of the game, of course, is the law. And you yourself are a law and economics scholar. You're the editor of the European Journal of Law and Economics. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that experience and of editing and working in that field, and of the particular type of being like a Buchanan or a Coasean in a field that's dominated more by Posnerians and whatnot. I'll just give a reference to the listeners, which is Buchanan wrote a review of Posner's first edition of his book on economic analysis of law, and the title of it is Good Economics, Bad Law. And I think that about sums up his position on these things. And if you follow after Coase won the Nobel Prize, Coase himself got in a knockdown, drag-out fight with Posner over the methodology of doing law and economics, which in fact resurrects a lot of the same kind of ideas. And so there's this conjunction in which Buchanan and Coase are on one side, and you have Posner and the vast majority of law and economics, and now you're the editor, and so you're getting papers submitted all the time. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think that and maybe it comes from Buchanan, but I think that there is a difference. It comes from Coase too. There is a difference between two ways of looking at law and economics as disciplines. Law and economics on the one hand, and the economic analysis of law. Most of the time, people don't think that there is a difference between them. One of the first who brought up the difference was Coase, probably at the end of the 1990s. I mean, explicitly.
Right.
Because at the end of the 70s and in the 80s, Coase has already written about the difference between his approach and Posner's approach. I mean, Posner-Becker's approach, which is quite similar. And there's a difference between law and economics. Means that we are economists. We take seriously law and institutions into account because economic activities take place in an institutional background. There's a difference between that and Posner's approach, which uses economics as a tool to analyze legal problems. So for Coase and for Buchanan, I think that economics is essentially defined by its subject matter. And then you study what falls within the boundary of this subject matter. And this is why Buchanan opposed to Posner's economic analysis of law. I've written a paper about that, comparing Buchanan and Posner on economic analysis of law. Buchanan invented public choice, but it disagreed. So he invented the idea that we could use economics to analyze political phenomena, but he disagreed with the idea that we could use economics to analyze legal phenomena. Yeah. Because politics is a kind of economic activity. Politics is exchange. Law is not about exchange.
Right.
And I think that is very Hayekian. I'm not the only one to think that, but is very Hayekian about law. And Posner and Hayek are very different in terms of about law. He's very Hayekian in the sense that law emerges for Buchanan. Law emerges from the interactions of between individuals. So there is a difference between law and economic analysis of law. And you asked me about how I could leave the for me, I'm much more interested in law and economics than in economic analysis of law. But the thing is that most of the papers that we receive are about economic analysis of law, because most of what the discipline, most of what the field is economic analysis of law. So we receive interesting articles in economic analysis of law. I cannot but urge people who think that they are more Coasian than Posnerian to submit papers to the journal. But
let that be an invitation, right?
Yeah. I mean, we are interested in publishing good articles, whether in law and economics or economic analysis of law. But people should not rely too much on, I would say, techniques, analytics to analyze legal problem. I mean, go back to the other editor of the journal, Giovanni Ramello, my friends said that law and economics should be comparative.
Yeah.
I agree with him.
Yeah.
So we have to compare institutions rather to really analyze them as if they were ideal institutions, which is more like what the
Buchanan.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's I think that one of my favorite exchanges in law and economics is actually between Buchanan and Warren Samuels on the Shoney versus Miller campaign, Supreme Court case, in which you have this problem of cedar rust. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating about it, it's a property rights case, it's political economy case, and the role of the status quo is about change. And so it relates to all of these issues again, and I was wondering, maybe you just have a few words to say about the relative status of the status quo in Buchanan, which is a very subtle issue in his. It goes back to your point about him being unwilling to impose on others, right? Because we have to begin with the here and now rather than just changing however I as a theorist begin with. But maybe you could elaborate that a little bit so that listeners could understand that aspect of Buchanan's thinking.
Again, this is something. So this is also why I find this writing this biography so interesting. This is something that has always been present in Buchanan's work. The idea that we start from something, we have to start from a certain point, and then look at the possible changes that we can make from this starting point. This does not mean that it was against, again, we talked about redistribution. This does not mean that we should not redistribute income or change the situation. But to change the situation, we have to evaluate the move from where we are to where we want to go. And we cannot evaluate this move if we have not a starting point. So the status quo is not something that is absolute, as you said. It's not something that is imposed and cannot change. And again, you look at the second article he wrote in 1954, individual and voting. No, I don't remember. Voting and the marketplace.
Yeah.
He explains that you have on the market there are inequalities. Inequalities in power, not inequalities in freedom. Inequalities in power mean that people, some people have more power than others. We can change that, he said. It does not accept that as an absolute. We can change that, but if we change that, we have to decide that together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's exactly what you said. So we can change any situation. He also said that, wrote that in many articles. So you can see that coming in different articles all over his career. So he said, not only after the 1970s, not only in the 70s when he was pessimistic, but also in the 60s, also in the 50s, you have a starting point. You can change. You can do whatever you want as a social group, but you have to do that collectively.
Yeah, in agreement.
And yes,
yeah. I have one last set of questions that I want to ask you, which is about the discipline of history of economic thought, of which you are a master practitioner, an established scholar in this field, and yet you've seen this field both be sort of in many ways grown tremendously over the last 20 years. The number of people that go to HES meetings have expanded, History of Economic Society meetings have expanded tremendously, yet at the same time it's still very difficult to have other economists in our field pay attention to history of economic thought. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about the disciplining effect of archives, the role of history of economic analysis in the history of economic thought, and whatnot, as advice to young people that would like to have a career in economics and devote a part of their time to the history of their discipline.
Well, yes, the history of economic society is a very interesting, congenial society. I mean, I met people who are very interesting, very, would say, devoted to the discipline they practice, but I mean, which sometimes may be a problem. No, I'm going to say why. Because I mean, that's the problem you were mentioning. Are we economists or are we historians? When I say that people are really devoted to their discipline, that they tend to forget one of the two aspects. Yeah. So we are historians of economics. So it means that we are economists, but we are also historians. Like in law and economics, it's very difficult to be to do law and economics because you have to know what law is and you have to be an economist too. Here it's the same thing. You have to, I think that sometimes people lose the perspective of being an economist and being an historian. So you have to be both at the same time, which is very difficult. So this is, well, I don't know if I succeed. Sometimes probably I fail as the others. And I think that people should not forget these two aspects. If I had an advice to give to students who are interested in doing history of economic thought, is trying to maintain the two, not forget that they are economists, but not forget that they are doing history too.
That's fantastic. I want to thank you very much, Alain, for taking the time today, and I want to sort of do a pre-advertisement for your book on Buchanan that's going to be coming out, and congratulate you again on the award that you've won for the excellent paper on the constructing of a constitutionalist. So,
thank you, Pete. Thank you for having me here. It's a great opportunity. I'm glad to have had the opportunity of this talk with you and talking about Buchanan. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.